Convict leasing in the South in this period becomes a new way of racial control among white Southerners attempting to limit African American economic independence and freedom in general. And what that means is that state officials would sell the labor of an African American prisoner to a private contractor. The terms of that agreement usually involved a period of time, say 10 days for a very minor sentence, to up to a year. And in exchange for getting the labor of the prisoner and taking full custody of the prisoner by the private contractor, the state would receive revenue. What that meant in terms of what convict leasing involved was that African Americans would work in any industry, whether working for a private farmer, whether it was in a brick-making factory, a coal mine, any number of business concerns, and the business owner would have absolute dominion over the black person for the period of time of the lease. But once you were in the system, you could spend the rest of your life there. And that was a direct consequence of the reality of being a convict lease and having to fight literally to survive day by day in incredibly brutal conditions.
Southern chain gangs were, surprisingly, a reform, were intended to be a reform. Chain gangs began to appear on the Southern landscape only as the terrible abuses of the convict leasing system began to be better known and more apparent, and calls for the first sort of feeble calls for reform of the convict leasing system began to be heard, and Southern states began to institute chain gangs partly as a way of ending the convict leasing system. Also, perversely, one of the biggest motivating factors behind the creation of the chain gangs were that Southerners all across the region were frustrated that the roads of the South were the most terrible imaginable roads in America. Commerce couldn't grow, the economy couldn't grow effectively, crops were lost in the fields simply because the roads were so terrible. And so the idea became rampant across the South that prisoners should be taken out of the mines and taken out of the circumstances they'd been in before, both because of the abuses that had occurred in some cases there, but also to put them to work on the roads and try to salvage something of the roads. And so the chain gang initially began as a reform over these terrible abuses that had been going on in the prison system before. But immediately the chain gang became as terrible, infamous, and notorious an institution in the South as convict leasing had been. Men sentenced to the chain gang, and a much smaller number of women sentenced to chain gangs, were being held by the government rather than by private contractors. But they experienced many of the same abuses that had happened with convict laborers before. They were chained together oftentimes day and night. They were subject to the most brutal kinds of punishment, rarely fed enough, rarely provided even the most minimally acceptable housing or medical care, lives that for many times months or years at a time of terrible abuse. Many people worked to death literally in their chains.
African American women were an important part of the chain gang labor force. Just like African American men and white men, they were required to participate in the construction of roads and bridges and in turpentine production. So they weren't exempt from hard manual labor and were required to do the same type of labor as men. The percentage of African American chain gang laborers was over 90%, with African American men comprising the largest majority. African American women were right behind, comprising approximately 5% of the chain gang population, with white men comprising 6% of the chain gang population, and white women comprising less than 0.1% of the chain gang population. The chain gang system in Georgia lasted until around the 1940s, and the chain gang system was brought down after the publication of Robert Burns's I'm a Fugitive from a Georgia Chain Gang, which fleshed out or brought to public attention the atrocities of the chain gang system of Georgia. And Burns was a white man. It takes a white man to bring it to the fore in order for officials to put forth a serious effort to bring forth the abolition